Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I want to thank our distinguished panelists and moderators that you're going to hear from, and thank you Aspen Institute and the Consumer Bankers Association for partnering in this event. Before we begin, let me remind you all that we are live streaming this event, helping struggling borrowers and fixing the federal student loan system. We welcome our live streaming audience, and they can join us in the conversation at #FixStudentDebt. The Bipartisan Policy Center was created a little over 10 years ago by 4 former majority leaders of the United States Senate. The Republican side, Senator Bob Dole and Howard Baker, the late Howard Baker. And on the Democratic side, Senators George Mitchell and Tom Daschle. I had the honor of working with all these leaders as a Senate staffer for many years. And at a time when bipartisanship seems in short supply, the mission of the center, as you might expect, is to bring together divergent views on major issues that confront the country and to advance sensible, pragmatic legislative solutions to those challenging issues. We're proud to be joined by the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program and the Consumer Bankers Association in that quest this afternoon. We're also honored to feature Representative Donna Shalala. I prefer to address her as Madam Secretary, significantly because she is the longest-serving Secretary of Health and Human Services in the country's history, serving the Clinton administration in that position from 1993 to 2001. One never knows how to introduce a person with the vast experience and knowledge that Secretary Shalala has, and she's attained in her unending, seemingly inexhaustible years of public service that continue even today as representing Florida's 27th Congressional District. The 27th District is the beneficiary, but equally as important, I think the U.S. House of Representatives, and indeed the country, clearly is the beneficiary of her talents and experience. Here in the Congress, she is on what we refer to as the Speaker's Committee, the powerful House Committee on Rules, but also, and not surprising, of course, the Education and Labor Committee. I also found it appropriate that she is a member of many caucuses, but the House Peace Corps Caucus. And that's appropriate because given she actually began her career in public service as one of the country's first Peace Corps volunteers in Iran. But she also has, of course, a broad background rooted in U.S. higher education, and for over a decade she served as president of the University of Miami. Previously, she was the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as president of Hunter College. An academic by training, she earned her PhD from Syracuse University. We are also honored at BPC to say that she's been involved in some of our efforts, particularly our task force on defense personnel, as well as our various nutrition initiatives. And more importantly, from my perspective, she co-chaired the Commission on Care for Returning Wounded Warriors with one of our founders, Senator Bob Dole. The Secretary has agreed to take a few questions after her comments. Due to the lack of roving microphones, I understand, jot down any questions you have for the Secretary, pass them along, and we will try to get as many in as possible in the time allowed before the Secretary has to leave. So without further ado, Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much. See, yes, thanks. Sorry, the podium's too high for me. Actually, I was 3 inches taller before the first time I came to Washington, so I'll speak from down here, or you just see the top of my head, which may be okay. Let me make some opening remarks about what is a very important issue, not just in higher education, but for our country in general, because what happens to a generation, particularly of young people, but one of the things we have to remember is that the student debt crisis is not just focused on young people. It's focused on a lot of middle-aged people that tried to get their degrees from a wide variety of institutions. First, I want to say, because I have been in both public and private higher education, I want to say a couple of words about why we are where we are, particularly for public higher education. If you look carefully at why the costs have increased, basically states have taken their money out of higher education. Increasingly, they have made less and less of a commitment. Now, some of their argument will be it's because of their Medicaid costs, but it's more than that. States no longer feel like higher education is at the center of their universe, and therefore their commitment to higher education has simply not kept up with costs. And as a result, the costs have shifted onto tuition and onto parents to pick up a larger and larger share of the cost of higher education. Second is the introduction of for-profit colleges into the higher education space, particularly eating up the big increase in Pell Grants. And without proper oversight of for-profit institutions, we see more and more people who have entered those institutions have not completed their degree, and have left with large amounts of debt, particularly low-income minority students. Once we made Pell Grants available for those kinds of institutions, they basically fed off of them and off of the student loan. So those two elements, in addition to the general driving up because of competition, the need for technology, compliance questions, for private higher education, if you look closely at where their increases have been, it's been to add layers and layers of administrative costs that are related directly to compliance and directly to competition with other institutions as they built better dormitories and better support services and a wide variety of recreational services for students. So a lot of things have driven and underlie the student debt crisis that we've had in this country. And it is a crisis. There's no question in my mind. And there's been a rise of student loan defaults. And while I can't blame higher education for all of this, higher education has not been as thoughtful as they should be about counseling students about the real impact of student loans on their lives, even though students aren't much interested in what's going to happen to them 10 years from now. The importance of disclosure, of transparency, of proper counseling for students. I can't tell you how many students, particularly in Miami, over the years, that I've convinced they had 1 year of an expensive tuition for a private university, which was my own, and I convinced them that they ought to go to the public community college, which would provide them very good training, and then transfer to the University of Miami and save 2 years of very high tuition. Both they and their families, often new immigrants, were certainly going to be better off if they did that, and they would still end up with the University of Miami degree. This was particularly true for students who, for one reason or another, were not eligible for scholarships. The third point is that universities, particularly the privates, discount their rates very dramatically. Looking at just the tuition of institutions isn't good enough. You have to look at their discount rates. And most of the private colleges, particularly those without large endowments, are discounting almost at least 50%. So very few people are actually paying the actual cost of higher education. But that leaves us with large student loans, and with an understanding that undergraduates are paying 28% more for college on average than they did a decade ago, and 65% more than they did 20 years ago. We used to have a joke in all the institutions that I was at that higher education becomes so expensive that none of us could have afforded to go full-time. Literally, the top echelon of our institutions, none of us could have gone full-time to school. We would have had to do work much more. And finally, let me say that one of the nice things about the report that everybody is working on here is it makes it very clear that the vast majority of students in higher education are working students. that they're not at traditional four-year colleges. The problem with federal policy is that almost all of it is focused on traditional schools. It has not been nimble enough or responsive enough to understand what's really happening in higher education. I tell the story of sitting in a governor's office, must have been 20 years ago, when I was secretary of HHS, and I was waiting to talk to him. He was on the phone with the legislative leader, and he was saying to the legislative leader, listen, we got to cut off aid after 5 years for all of the students in our higher education. And I literally walked up to him and tapped him on the shoulder and asked him to put the phone on hold while I lectured him on what the real students in his state were about. And he got back on the phone and he said, well, maybe not 5 years, he said. He said, I've got someone in my office that thinks we ought to look very carefully at who our students are in the States. It always occurred to me that I probably saved thousands of students in that state from getting their financial aid cut off, because he had an image in his head of if kids didn't finish in 5 years, you know, they were just hanging around and eating up state money, as opposed to understanding that the vast majority of students in this country are working and going to school. It's going to take them much longer. It also means that universities have to be organized for that. When I first got early in my career, when I was in my 30s, when I became president of Hunter College, I convinced the faculty, in exchange for things like private offices, that we had to teach from 7:30 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. And the reason for that is that we had working students in the middle of New York City. And I convinced them that we should offer degrees in the morning, in the afternoon, and in the evening, and that we should organize ourselves for that because of the working schedules of our students, that we had to be far more responsive. The problem is that most of the leaders in higher education have come out of traditional four-year colleges. They're not working class. They're not thinking about the students that they have. They didn't spend years trying to get their degrees. And they have this image in their heads of a traditional school. And because of that, and because of their impact on higher education, and their impact on federal policy, we're just starting to seriously consider these issues in higher education. And we've gotten ourselves into a bind with very high loans, in my judgment. Debt that students literally will have a struggle. So we've started to introduce bills to help students cut down on those loans. One of the bills we've introduced is public service under previous law took 10 years for you to pay off. We've introduced a bill to put it at 5 years. When I joined the Peace Corps, they actually cut our loans during the 2 years I was in the Peace Corps. And we need to do that kind of thing again, and reducing the number of years is important. We've also introduced bills to increase transparency so that families actually understand the impact of that debt in years out and what the interest rates will be. They need to see the numbers before they sign up for the debt, and they need to be counseled to see what their alternatives are. So Congress is beginning to act. The best way to cut down on these costs is to increase Pels and to make them far more flexible than they've been. We struggle over whether we're going to cover the summer. Poor students who are working go to school all year round. They try to pick up courses wherever they can. And the Pell Grants have to be necessarily flexible, both in the number of years and in the times in which you can use your Pell Grants. And that would help a lot in terms of student loans. And then we have to hold the institutions accountable, it seems to me. But transparency is absolutely critical if we're really going to deal with this. We have all sorts of bills that we've introduced to cut the interest rates, and Congress is very concerned about. The fact is that you can borrow money for a car and for a house cheaper than you can a student loan. And we need to cut down the interest rates on student loan. We ought not to be making money in this country on our investments in the future and in the students in particularly. I'm currently working on introducing legislation that will disclose an estimate of a student's projected monthly payment based on the amount of loans that they take out. That's full transparency. What are you going to have to pay when you graduate if you take out a certain amount of loans? And hopefully, all of us will understand that transparency is essential to making informed decisions for a lifetime. I sat on one of the biggest homeowners, actually it was a home builders board, and in which the CEO actually wanted to incorporate student loans into the mortgage, which was an interesting and creative idea. And the reason he wanted to do that is because the mortgages were lower than the student loans, and students that had big student loans couldn't buy houses. So it was self-interest as well as an attempt to try to figure out how to do that. But you try to talk to Fannie Mae about how much you can incorporate into a mortgage, because everybody is living in their silos. Those kinds of creative solutions where we bundle the payments is also something that we ought to be looking at. We can't solve this crisis overnight, but to solve it, we have to understand it. We have to understand who our clients are and who these students are, what their age distribution is, what kinds of institutions they're going to, and hold those institutions accountable in the years ahead. Congress can help, and it clearly is since we give the loans out, it clearly is a federal responsibility, but it also has a lot to do with the future of the country. Because if you talk to people the way I do, where their lives are stunted, their ability to buy homes, their ability to change jobs, their ability to get other kinds of loans because they have the student loan debt for years and years, then you understand that whatever we do is an investment in the future of the country. Thank you very much, Bill, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
I'm going to make an executive decision here. It's a small enough room. If you have a question, just raise your hand and shout it out so we can.
You don't have to shout very loud. I teach a class this large.
Any questions for the Secretary? I'll start it off, Madam Secretary. Given the Higher Education Reauthorization Act is up this year, what's your prognosis here in the House and in the Senate?
Well, in the House, I think we'd like to do something very comprehensive. Chairman Scott would like to do a number of things. We certainly will focus on student debt. There's no question about that. In the Senate, I actually went over and had lunch with Senator Alexander, who I've known for many years. And I think he wants to do a more limited bill. But he has a very good relationship with Patty Murray, with the vice chair, the ranking member, Patty Murray. So I think we're going to be able to work something out. This is another area that clearly can be bipartisan. So I think we have a shot at working something out, and particularly in the student debt area. There are some other issues in higher education, sexual harassment, those issues where we're having some struggle with the secretary. But on student debt in particular, I think there's consensus we have to do something.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I'm Lamont Jones from Diverse Issues in Higher Education Magazine. I have a question about student loan discharge. Senator Warren has, during the Democratic nomination, has recommended or has proposed out is looking at possibility of discharge up to a certain amount. What are your views on discharge regarding the prospect?
I assume her use of the word discharge is that we write off a certain amount of money. I think that the combination of public service as a way of doing that, I think I can sell to my constituents if people do something for that to occur. And public service is one way of doing it. And but I've never believed in this 10-year business. 10 years is a lifetime. I can't tell you, 10 years I was in the Peace Corps, I was in graduate school, and I got tenure by that time, I think. And that's a long time. That, for me, was a lifetime. though now looking back, it doesn't seem like it was a long period of time. So I think that if we reduce the number of years to 5 years, that in fact is an opportunity for us to do it. I also want to hold particularly the for-profits accountable, because particularly for minorities, for older people, they're making promises they can't keep, and the graduation rates are terrible, and the debt rates are terrible. And while they started out living off Pell Grants, the combination of their making it easy for people to get loans, to use the loan system, has caused incredible problems. My mother lived to 103. She had 4 home health care workers. All of them were in for-profit colleges at one point or another in their lives. They were all minorities. They were all pretty low income. And all of them had debt. And my mother, who used to be a teacher and a school board member, said to me before she died, I want you to pay off their debt with whatever money I have left, because I want them to be able to start their lives again. Boy, when I went through what the kinds of commitments that they had made without full knowledge of what they were doing, the fact that none of them had finished their degrees, I learned, I knew the numbers, but talking to people about their lives and how their lives had been changed because of this, and the burden of debt on them and their families, was an incredible experience. So they're all, by the way, graduating from 4-year nursing programs now.
Any other question? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Donna. Two quick stories and one question. So my daughter is graduating from college, and she's going through the post-loan counseling, which is great. And she said to me, wow, who knew about this thing called interest? And I was shocked. She'd gone through 4 years of college.
Yeah.
My little high school. Second story.
By the way, that's what my bill will do. It will tell her and her family, before they sign for the loan, exactly what her monthly payment will be, including the interest.
And the second story, when she started, and, we told her, in-state, you'll go for free. If you go out of state, you graduate with $10,000 in student loan. She's 18 years old. She said, was that a lot of money? Faced with that question, she didn't know.
Yeah, her parents did, though. I had student loans. I had $25,000 in student loans.
Right, so the voter question, we could help her, but what's the role for more counselor?
I,
High school level.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not only counseling at the high school level, it's counseling at the college level. College financial aid has to be more than mechanical. And that's why the transparency of what it's actually going to cost you when you graduate if you borrow this amount of money, what the interest rate is. I have a cousin that actually, he was so smart, he just kept paying the interest while he was in college. So he actually just had the core of the loan, and that hadn't accumulated for him. But I don't know anyone else that did what he did. He's making a lot of money now. He was obviously a smart finance major. But that's the importance of both transparency and making judgments about what the family can afford. And it used to be that we could work during the summer and pay our tuition for the next semester. You know how old I am when I say things like that. But you can't do that anymore. You're lucky if you can make enough for your spending money during the year. So we just have to have more information to parents and to the kids. And it's the responsibility of both higher education and the parents and the young person.
We have time for about one more question.
There's one back there.
Justin Ham with Navient. I just had a question about what do you think the best way to go about, college accountability? What would the best way to go about that? Do you think of shared agreements? Do you think it's providing more information on students after they graduate and what they're making, things of that nature? What do you think would be the best way to go about college accountability?
First of all, colleges, because they want their graduation rates to be up, have some interest in making sure that they have packages for their students. Most colleges. not just because of the ranking system, because that's the standard, the gold standard for an institution to get their students through. So that there is some incentive there. But it's the transparency of the loans and the real cost of college that is not just the tuition and the room and board, but the other out-of-pocket costs. And they look like, and families' ability to plan. But I've dealt with families my whole career who were not English-speaking, in which the parents needed help filling out the FAFSA proposals. So it's everybody combined has to take some responsibility to make sure we're producing a generation of people that can actually move on in their careers and move into the middle class and not overly burdened with the cost of higher education. So it's 5,000 elements from my point of view. It's not a single one. It's not writing off the debt. It's not, it's everybody taking responsibility.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
You're welcome.
And thank you for your service, long service to the country, and your continued service.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.